LVC here, and we're in for part 2 of something extremely important with NFL betting. And let me tell you something. There's 3 of us here to do something out of just pure interest and joy and something that's extremely valuable in all of our handicapping. And we're sharing it with you just for the hell of it. And we had part 1. Welcome back, Ron. How you doing today?
Doing great. Looking forward to this. Looking forward to sharing the screen with somebody I've known about for a while, but have never shared the screen with. So this is exciting to me. Another perspective on a very important topic.
Scott Kellen, it's great to have you here. My partner on the Bet US weekly shows for 50 plus shows. Great friend of mine. Thank you for joining. I know him to know this stuff inside and out. This conversation is going to be very interesting to basically see all the little nuanced stuff that's important about handicapping. It's just not flipping coins here. You're going to notice that awfully quick. But welcome, Scott. And let me have you explain just quickly what the Pythagorean is to you.
Hey, Chris, good to be here and good to be here with you as well, Ron. Pythagorean for me is just a good starting point at the beginning of the year where we're trying to find where teams might have been overvalued or undervalued from their play from the previous season, and really just provides a starting point to get going to doing the research into the new football season. We're just trying to find value teams that are either overvalued or were undervalued from the previous season. That's really what I'm trying to do.
What are the major things that you use to change that number? You said it's a starting point. What's important to you where you're moving those numbers and changing the values?
Well, I mean, first of all, from the Pythagorean standpoint, it's in and of itself, of course, it's going to give you a number that's going to tell you how many games a team should have won last year based on their data. And you're going to obviously reference that to what the team actually won. That's going to be your starting point to really say, okay, did they win more or less than they should have? Beyond that, then, other things that I'm looking at are, did they have a lot of close wins within the season? Did they take big jumps from the previous year? And then, a whole bunch of other things. Roster transition, obviously, all those things are going to come into play into this as well, as just a starting point here as well.
Ron, what about you?
Very much the same starting point. And then I go and I look at turnovers. I look at turnovers in terms of random turnovers, fumbles versus interceptions, which are more repeatable from year to year, depending on quarterback stability. I'm looking at schedule, and that's very important to me as well. Did they play a first place schedule? Did it play a fourth place schedule? We're looking at injuries. How much did that factor in? And one other factor, and that's what was referenced a little bit by Scott, the one-score games. If you flip it around, if a team went 2-5 in one-score games, what if you flipped it from 5-2? Would that make a difference? So every little thing adds a little incremental value to where I'm looking at as a starting point for the next season.
Let's throw this into like a direct application and look back at, let's just say 2020. And here's the chart of Scott's chart for 2020, and apologies, the teams' names are compressed, but Scott, if you will, just quickly, we did a little bit of this in the first episode, but explain the few highlights that really stick out and why the first reason why this chart is so important.
Yeah, on the chart, Chris, anything red is overachieving, anything green is underachieving. I'm going to focus on the red, and then as a starting point, if you saw that slide previous, we were talking about double whammies and triple whammies. And by the way, I found this interesting talking to Ron before we started the show. He's like, hey, I use this same terminology. It just has slightly different meanings. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But if we go back to that chart, The first things I'm looking at when I create these numbers are what teams overachieved by 2 or more wins. So this is the 2020 season going into last year. There was 5 teams that overachieved by 2 or more wins. The Buffalo Bills, the Cleveland Browns, the Kansas City Chiefs, the Green Bay Packers, and the Seattle Seahawks. So that's my starting point. So those 5 teams going into last year, they've got my attention that they possibly overachieved. The next piece of that is kind of the double whammy here is Ron referenced the 1-score games. I define it by 7 points or less. You could do 8. But now what I'm looking for is teams that overachieved in these 1-score games with a net of 4 wins or more. So we can see Cleveland was 7-2 in close games last year. And this stuff, as you guys talked about in that first video, it tends to regress back to the mean. So we've got some overachieving done here by Cleveland at 7-2. We've got Kansas City, which was unbelievably 8-0. And we got Seattle here, which was 7-3 as well. So that's my starting point here as far as the double whammy stuff is that, okay, they overachieved by 2 wins or more, and they were extremely fortunate in close games. Cleveland, Kansas City, and Seattle were really my starting points in regards to that. And then just one other thing that happens to apply to one of these teams, I also noticed in my research, teams that take massive jumps in wins one season versus the next. And by that, I define it by they won 5 games more or more than the previous season. Now, going into last year, and we're looking at the 2020 season, Cleveland and Miami both won 5 games or more than the previous season. Chris, it's kind of like you ever date a girl and then like the next day after your first date, she's emailing, texting, calling you. It's like it's a little too soon, a little too quick. Well, when you have 5 or more wins like Cleveland and Miami had going into last season, that's a pretty big jump. It's a little too soon, a little too fast, and there's generally some regression that can come into play. And as this speaks to Cleveland, they overachieved, they won a lot of close games, and they massively overachieved from the year before. That's a big red flag going into the following season.
That's some good stuff there. And, again, I didn't reference the, how we get to those numbers, but we're basically looking at all the total points scored, and there's a formula there that assigns the value, and that's how you get the differences on this. And the extremes kind of stick out there, and that's what gives us that starting point.
Yeah, it's the eye test when you see Cleveland and they went something like 11-5 in 2020, and then they're minus 11 in point ratio. It's pretty obvious that if you've been outscored by 11 points, you're much closer to 8-8 than 11-5. And then the double whammy for me is when you look at the turnover ratios, and if you have a double-digit plus or double-digit minus, that's going to, in many cases, regress to the mean. Each turnover, we talked about this in the previous show, is worth somewhere around 3.5 or more points. And those things matter, especially as scoring goes up. The triple whammy for me is when you factor in the schedule. And to piggyback on Scott and what he said about Cleveland, you look at a Cleveland team that all of a sudden has a massive schedule upgrade from what they had in the past, which means somebody in the division had a massive schedule downgrade. On top of that, they're playing their uncommon opponents are going to be either 1 versus 1, first place versus first place, second place versus second place, as opposed to a 4th place versus 4th place, which is what Cleveland was the previous year. And then more primetime games, more short weeks. If that also slides them into weight, they weren't as good as they were, what the record said there was going to be. And then you have the situation, well, wait a second, and now they're going to have some schedule issues and maybe some turnover issues. That's the triple whammy.
What other kind of the list on the screen here? There's a lot of stuff there. Also, do you have anything else that you use, Scott? Or
Christy, I'll go back and I'll answer that question. I want to go back and just a couple of things I hit, and just maybe kind of back it up with a little bit of data too, just to kind of make the point and have that point hit home. I talked about looking at teams that overachieve by 2 or more games versus the Pythagorean theorem. If we go back to 2007, there's been 31 teams. It's about 2 teams a year, roughly. We had 5 last year, looking at that graph. But 31 teams have overachieved by 2 wins or more. Those 31 teams have gone 22, 7, and 2 as far as betting their season over-under total the following season. So when these teams vastly overachieve, they come back down to earth in relationship to what the odds maker has set their season over-under number to. And then if we go one step further and we find these teams that won these close games and had a net close game wins of 4 games or more, of those 31 teams, they have gone 18-4-1 to the under. So there's 23 of those 31 won close games by a net win of 4 or more the previous season, and 18 out of those 23, 18-4-1 to the under the following season. So it's one thing to say, hey, these teams overachieve. We all understand that. But then when you look at the data in terms of, because the other thing that comes into play here is, well, what does the odds maker set their number at? If they won 10 games last year, but now their over-under number is at 5, well, that's a drastic difference. That's kind of hard to get a handle on. But so the odds maker is obviously setting that number, and we know when they're overachieving, that 22, 7, and 2 and 18, 4, and 1, these teams are going under their season win total by a large amount year after year in relationship to that. So
let me point something out, because I went into this, while I do pretty well in the NFL, this has not been something that I have primarily used in my handicapping. So I've been on a little bit of a learning curve on this myself. So the way that it's working for me, I feel like I'm starting to get a really good flow. And so let me explain the flow that I understand. We're getting to these, I know how we're getting to these numbers. We just explained that clearly, and we're seeing those major differences. And those are very good starting points. So just going from, we've discussed the variables that are important. Let's just go to turnovers here. And I want to point these out and have you comment on this, Ron, is over here, we've got the fumbles on this side, and we've got the interceptions ranked 1 through 32 for each teams. So just from what I've learned so far, we're going to be looking at these extremes, and we're going to be factoring that in, and we're going to apply a value based on these extremes to the main initial number that was created. Correct, Ron?
Yeah. So the best example, and I've given this in the past, is that Green Bay had a double-digit plus turnover, but nothing's changed at the quarterback position. Aaron Rodgers is still there. He still doesn't like to throw interceptions. He'll throw it away. He'll do whatever. He certainly doesn't throw red zone interceptions. The perception is that plus 13 is not going to veer too much in the following year, which will be 2022. On the other hand, Arizona, with their plus 12 turnover ratio, had plus 10 in fumbles alone. And that's not sustainable. I mean, fumble luck. There's an art to stripping the ball from somebody, but all the teams practice stripping the ball from somebody. And it could just be that quarterback that they faced. You'd have to do a deeper dive into the number of fumbles that each quarterback had that Arizona played. But most likely that number is going to regress to the mean. I haven't gotten a read that Kyler Murray is going to have Aaron Rodgers type turnover ratio luck all the way through, that he's going to throw 4 interceptions a year like Aaron Rodgers does. So you're going to lose for every turnover roughly 3.5 or 4 points from Arizona's total. And I'm going to use that data when I look at the starting point for me as to where Arizona's season wins are going to be.
I think it's whether you're using this chart or not, this is important for all NFL handicapping, is to factor in the turnovers. And a lot of people don't realize that the fumble is much more random, and the interceptions are much more predictive. And I know from the previous show that you have a different level that you apply them for. Scott, what do you do as far as the fumbles and the interceptions, as far as valuing them?
Yeah, no, I think a lot of what Ron does, Chris, and as you're going through the season as well, you might find a team that maybe, I'm just making up numbers here, but let's say we've got a team that's 7-3 for the year. They average 5.5 yards of play on offense. They give up 5.5 yards of play on defense. That would speak to being a pretty average team. But why are they 7-3? Well, some of the numbers you see in this chart here might be indicating as to why. They might be extremely fortunate from a turnover standpoint. And even though they're an average team from the line of scrimmage, which is probably more likely to play out the rest of the year, but when they get some good fortunes, another team on here, as we look at this, the Dallas Cowboys got an incredible amount of interceptions last year. And the name's escaping me now. Oh, it was Diggs, Stephon Diggs' brother.
Yeah.
You got a lot. He's a ball hawk, right? So he does, and he might continue to have a knack to find the ball because he seems to have some of that ability. But he got burned on a lot of his passes. And if you look at like yards per route run for him, he was giving up a pretty high number, which tells me he's not a great cornerback, but he was generating some turnovers. We'll see what happens from that. But so this turnover data can be used in a lot of ways to really kind of find some hidden stuff within a team that maybe they're a little bit more fortunate than what they're going to be for the rest of the year, or in the case of what we're talking about, really translating it now to the following season.
It's just important to remember this stuff is extremely important to use all season long. It's not a look at it a couple times a year type of thing.
Yeah, I could piggyback on that, and I'm glad that Scott's in the camp that I am with Diggs. I thought he was more of a liability than an asset, even though he got all those accolades. But in season, what you just said, Chris, is so incredibly important because Kansas City, one of the teams with negative Pythag going into 2021, they started the season with an all-new offensive line. If you look through from week 7, 8, and 9, they were at one point -9 in turnover ratio, which actually flipped a little bit more to -11. They were in 4th place, and there was a lot of value in terms of betting them to win the division. That turnover number to me was random at that time, and it was going to regress back to positive. The offensive line was playing every single game together. They were getting more cohesive. They were playing teams for the second time within their division. They had a rough road with some of the tougher opponents being in the first half of the season. And by season's end, they had a plus turnover ratio, and they were right back to where we thought they would be at the top of the division.
So going on with what I was saying, we did the turnovers, and that's one adjustment that we're working off of these numbers that we're coming up with here. Injury luck, which we're looking at, were we particularly unlucky, or were we particularly lucky that we faced teams in very bad situations? Both of you guys do factor that in. How heavily do you guys factor that in, though?
It factors in for sure, Chris. One thing I'll mention with this Pythagorean too is you get late in the season, you can kind of use this. Now, I've never done it and done a big study on it to know how profitable or unprofitable it is. But you get into weeks 15, 16, 17, you could take these numbers and start to apply them to lines potentially late in the season as well, because Ron said it very well. As simplistic as this is, it's very powerful, and it's really just a measure of points scored and points allowed. And as Ron said, if you've scored the same amount of points that you've given up, you're basically a 500 team, give or take. But if you're, sitting 4 games above 500, you're probably going to be valued by the odds maker and the public as being a better team than you are. So you can play into that. And injuries certainly come into that role as well. I was looking, if you look back last year, Russell Wilson was out for a few games. Daniel Jones, say what you want about Daniel Jones, but, as bad as the Giants were, they regressed even worse, without him. And you start to look at the numbers from that standpoint. Injuries are huge in this, and from year to year, they're huge. In 2020, Miami won 10 games. The Pythagorean number I'm going to round up was about 10. So you say, okay, well, they won 10 games. They should have won 10 games. But you got to remember, Tua played, really, let's call it the second half of that year. They had Ryan Fitzpatrick at the beginning. Well, with Tua's numbers, they only had a Pythagorean of about 8.6 if you translated it out. So, again, it kind of tells you that their wins sometimes get overachieved. And whether it's a starting quarterback gets hurt and somebody else goes in there, or they're just replacing a quarterback like they did with Tua, I think you have to look at that data as well.
Ron, you touched on some of the scheduling issues. And I kind of touched on that when I brought up the injuries is, were you lucky to face teams in certain situations, or were they lucky to face you? And what else are we talking about as far as the scheduling? Off the top of my head, we're talking about, long rest, travel time, what time of the year they're playing in hot weather, cold weather. What other scheduling issues do you feel that are important when you're digesting the whole season schedule?
If you have a team, for example, not used to playing in prime time on a Monday night or a Sunday night standalone game, and then they come back and they play a non-divisional game, even if it's Buffalo against Jacksonville. We saw Buffalo lose to Jacksonville, or a team from the NFC playing the AFC, an opponent they're not familiar with, and they've had a day and a half less preparation from Monday night to a Sunday early afternoon game. I'm looking for that. I'm also looking at something I've discussed in the past, where are the new coach bye weeks? Because they're entering a new situation. If they've never been a head coach before, it's too hard to adjust in the NFL on a week-by-week basis. You're barely staying alive with all the minutia that you're having to deal with. But if you have that early bye week, you can save the season like the Philadelphia Eagles did by looking at what they do best, which was running the ball, but they weren't running 22 times per game versus 38 and 39 after their mini bye week. So you can make some self-season adjustments. So if you have the Pythag and you have the schedule difficulty and you have all these variables, and then you have a late bye and a new coach, that's another angle that I'm looking at that says, wait a second, they're not going to be able to make adjustments in time to save their season.
So we had Kiev from the Odds Breakers on last week, and he had a beautiful chart like Scott has provided here for what happened last year. And obviously the initial Pythag numbers are going to be the same, but all three of you have a different number now. So here's my question is, how are you valuing each of the variables that we've been talking about? The turnovers, the injuries, the strength of schedule flow, the coaching changes, the roster changes, the draft, all these different things. How are you actually, applying a decimal point and making these little numbers move? How do you know how much to factor them in and how important they are? Scott, where's your starting point with adjustments?
Well, my starting point, I go back, what I said earlier, Chris, where I'm looking for a team that overachieved by 2 or more wins. I want this team that was incredibly successful in the close games. I'll start there. I'm looking for teams that won 5 or more games. We know since 1983, 101 teams have won 5 or more games than they did the previous year. Only 11 of those 101 teams actually won as many games or more if they won 10 games the previous season. So that's
my start. Your secret sauce. How are you changing the numbers, though? We know what the factors are. How are you applying the numbers?
Well, you can apply it in a lot of ways. So first of all, Forever Cantor here in Vegas did it, and then I think Westgate picked it up last year, where they would create a line for every single game through 17. I think Westgate actually did it for 18 weeks last year, even the 18th week, which is a big variable week. You can take those lines and try to apply those to a percent of chance of winning a game, and you can come up with a number for that team as well. That's another point to use where you can create how many wins a team will get just based on the line that the odds maker has set. Again, it's a guess. There's some perception in it, all that, so it's not perfect. But when you start to line up 2, 3, 4 metrics, and then you've got injuries or the turnover luck is, that Ron spoke to. I'm just looking for just to stack things on top of each other. And if I get enough of those, that's a very, very good starting point for me to possibly go forward. And, if you're being asked to win 9, 10, 11 games, I'm usually looking to play under in most of these, right? And obviously injuries to, the team that you're playing under can help you. So if I can find a fairly high win total, stack a whole bunch of these things together, I think I've got a decent chance to come out ahead with that.
Okay, so what I'm kind of understanding is we start off with that hard, number, and then you're kind of piling in everything at once into a hamburger patty, and you're deciding, how much that hamburger patty is going to matter. And basically that's your secret sauce. There is no, each of the factors don't have a certain percentage of value or can move the needle, a specific decimal point of value, correct?
Correct. And, Ron kind of mentioned with the scheduling, maybe a team won 10 games last year, but, if they're playing 17 games now, maybe 13 of those games came against teams that were all finished below 500. Maybe they had a really easy schedule. And now, and again, it's a guess because you don't know. Yes, the numbers are set for a team to win 8, 9, 10 games this year, and that may not play out. Look at Cincinnati last year. We thought everyone playing Cincinnati was playing a fourth place schedule type team, and now, of course, they end up winning the division. So there's variables there, but there's no percentage applied to each of these metrics for me. If I can stack enough together, and the reason I reference those historical numbers, I know that stuff over the last 10, 15 years has worked. Stack enough of them together, and now I've got a very good starting point for me to possibly make a play.
So, Ron, are you working with a hamburger patty also, or is your secret formula and adjustments a little bit different?
I think I'm fighting Scott for the same hamburger because it's really, it really is piling on. The NFL, we're all creatures of habit to one form or another. Every July 4th, my alarm wakes up, goes bing, 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 time to look at the college football and do this on this day and do this and get ready for this and so on. The NFL's like that too. They like to be scheduled. These teams like to have Sunday afternoon. And when you deviate from that, that's another data point that can be used. The turnovers can be used. The new coach information can be used. Quarterback changes that weaken a team or strengthen a team. We're going to deal with Russell Wilson in Denver and the lack of Russell Wilson in Seattle. Injuries, like Scott said. What do you do with Lamar Jackson missing 5 or 6 games? Yet Baltimore didn't adjust their game plan. They kept going for 2 and having these super close games, 1 and 2 point games all the way down the stretch, running the same offense with a quarterback without that running skill set. They tried 2 game-winning 2-point conversions instead of playing for overtime with a backup quarterback. What if Lamar Jackson plays in those 2 games? What if Russell Wilson plays in the 2 games they lost by a field goal instead of Geno Smith? So we're just looking at all these factors, and it's going to be, one of those McDonald's burgers that just goes, this high or something like that, if you're lucky. And then you get something that I agree completely with Scott in that most of my plays, almost all my plays, are going to be under because you're going contrary to the public to begin with. The numbers are skewed to the over. If you could stack it where a team's going to regress, that's what I'm looking at.
Yeah, you hit the nail right on the head. We didn't touch on it in the first show. The cumulative win losses are almost always, there are more overs than unders on the number of games if you add up all the teams, and that's for all the sports. So there's going to be more value found on the unders overall. It doesn't mean you only play unders. There's certainly overs that you could find some value on. Quick side note, you guys do other sports. The Pythag works in other sports, all the sports, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Baseball,
there's
for sure.
Yeah, there's a different formula for each sport, right, that you put in there. And again, this stuff's so well known, you can usually just typically Google and get the numbers to use for that. I think Kiev spoke about it last week. I think it's 2.37 or something for NFL. But yeah, so the sports have different formulas or numbers to use within it. But yes, you can apply it Because again, Chris, it's points for, points against, right?
Yep.
It sounds so simplistic that you tend to dismiss it. But I've done this long enough. You don't really dismiss anything until you've really looked at it. And we've looked at this stuff, and it seems to work to a certain degree for us.
Yeah, the formula is out there. This isn't a new concept. The NFL is an analytics-driven league more and more and more. You could just look at the LA Chargers with what they did on every single fourth down. Everybody's looking for that edge. The bookmakers are looking for the edges. So we're all dealing in that universe. It's how we apply the data that matters. And, that's what makes a play good for some people and not good for others. How are we stacking the hamburger?
I know you had a question for Scott here that's scrolling across the screen. Go ahead and ask away.
Okay. Which one is scrolling there? Okay, teams gaining and losing quarterbacks. The reason why I'm looking at this is because we're seeing more blockbuster trades this year than ever before. As wide receivers get paid $28 million a year, as quarterbacks get paid $50 million a year, even if they didn't play the previous year, Deshaun Watson, for example. It's going to change chemistry. It's going to affect the team that lost that quarterback and the team that found the quarterback. And I think, this is going to happen every year. This isn't a 1 year off anymore. Teams are going to be dealing with how much of the salary cap is going to be tied to quarterbacks in their first contract, their second contract, and so on. So, Scott, my question to you is, anything that you're looking at differently now with the changes, the massive changes that we're starting to see in terms of how you're preparing for the 2022 season?
Well, one thing I started doing last year, Ron, and it applies to kind of every position, but obviously the quarterback being the most important one. I'm trying to do more with player ratings themselves, because what I've always done in the past is I'll look at team stats, but then you have a Russell Wilson missed 3 games. Okay, well, you kind of have to take Russell Wilson out, or remove those 3 games to a degree, right? Because they certainly can greatly impact. Lamar Jackson obviously can impact the stats. So what I'm trying to do is use the player ratings a little bit more, where literally I give a rating to every single player that starts. Every player's got a rating, but I look at the starters for the most part, and it's a little bit easier to plug and play. So, and it seems like there's, what I've got so far seems to be pretty good. I'm going to do a deep dive this summer, and I'm going to find out, Ron, either I'm on something or I'm on to something, one of those two things, right? So, but that's one thing I've done just to counter. I'm looking to make a little bit quicker adjustments. Don't have to rely on the data necessarily and relying on the player rating. I think that's one thing. I think you're right. This is as long as teams like the Rams did last year, if that continues to be successful, teams are going to do this. There's more cap money with these TV deals and whatnot, so teams can afford to spend more money. They're going to take shots and try to get the most important position, especially at the quarterback position, to try to improve their team greatly immediately. So I'm just trying to be prepared from that standpoint and just use data in a little bit different way to be able to evaluate what those changes might mean. The chemistry thing, that's hard, right? It's, some teams are going to have better chemistry, but even look at Brady 2 years ago. That took a little while for Brady and that offense to get going for Tampa Bay, right? So you definitely have to keep that in the back of your mind as well.
One of my concerns was, and I've heard it on other podcasts, where handicappers feel that they erred with the injuries by, doing something as similar that you're doing, speaking of, with putting value on people, but it just seemingly, it's just as easy to overvalue or undervalue too much. So it just seemed like the common denominator was that teams were heavily injured, and boy, you made it sound like, that they were much more injured than what they ended up performing. So I ask you guys, what do you guys see it along the same lines? Do you think that the teams fared better when you thought that they were in horrible injury situations last season? or about what you would have expected?
Well, for me, the quarterback position, unfortunately, the way I used to handicap, it's become more and more important because the rules favor quarterbacks. When they run, they're treated as quarterbacks, you can't hit them like running backs. When you tackle below the knee or above something in the stomach or whatever, they get a 15-yard penalty. So missing a quarterback is just that much more important. But I'm looking at cluster injuries. That's when it matters more to me. 2 cornerbacks out, 2 offensive linemen out. If it's one here, one there, I'm not going to give it as much weight in my handicapping as if it's 2 to the same general position area.
Scott, when you go back and do that look back, I'd be very interested to see what you find in those cluster type situations, because I can tell you I particularly paid attention to cluster injury situations, and I feel I got the short end of the stick the entire season last year. It just seemed like teams were able to overcome those situations. Have you done any work on that yet in your autopsy of last season?
Not with the autopsy, but I mean, I feel exactly the same as what Ron said. The quarterback position, if you look at some of these other positions, Chris, defensive linemen, linebackers, offensive linemen, to a degree, I'm speaking in general terms here now, a player is not worth more than a half point in a lot of these scenarios. So yeah, you got a player out, and quite frankly, it might only be 0.2 or 0.3 points because the replacement guy is worth something, generally speaking, right? So to your point, one guy's out, not a big deal. Yeah, some positions are more important. You start to get cluster injuries, 3 or 4 injuries, on the defense or something, that can add up a little bit. And of course, the quarterback, that can be worth 3 to 5 to 7 to 8 points, depending on who it is. That's where you're going to have your major adjustment. But I will take a look at that. One of the things I want to do this year when I go look at it is I want to be able to just make a quick adjustment in my Excel spreadsheet for the position of the player. And I'll be able to very quickly through the whole season be able to see, okay, am I valuing that position too much or too little? And hopefully be able to find something there where you can hone it in a little bit as well. So, but I've always believed cluster injuries make a big difference at certain position levels within a team. And we'll see what that data presents, but I still think that is a factor.
I have another comment to make to Chris's point there. It's not just the value of the starter, but the difference between the value of the starter and the value of the person that's going to take their place. We see that at quarterback all the time, but we maybe underestimate that if they lose a cornerback and the next man up is pretty close in value to that. If you're talking about a team like the Rams, who are so top heavy and Hall of Famers, and then the next man up is not even close, just getting minimum salary, versus the Minnesota Vikings, who drafted for almost mediocrity year after year after year, maybe there's not that much difference between losing your top guy and your second guy. So you really have to look and see what's the value of the replacement and how close that position, that person is to the starter.
You articulated what I bumbled my way through trying to explain very well. That's pretty much what my point was, is a lot of these situations may be a lot closer than we realize. They look ugly, but they're not as ugly. And as a Lions fan, I seem to notice that because they were pulling people off the streets at some point, and you couldn't give them any credit. You almost had them as invisible players in the lineup at some point, but somehow they ended up doing okay. Any last thoughts before we wrap this show up? Any comments on? We were talking pre-show on sources that we use for all this data that we're acquiring. I think that's an interesting topic. How are you guys getting your data?
For me, Chris, I've done this for so long. You use different sources, and then all of a sudden they just kind of go away, and now you're finding a new source. And one that I used a couple years ago, and they've been bought out, but it was called Armchair Analysis. And I think they were bought out by a company called FTN, I believe, Frank, Tom, Nancy. And they provide play-by-play data, can subscribe to it. It's very inexpensive. They send it to you every Sunday night. It's a lot of data, and so you can go through there and figure out what's meaningful to you and what's not meaningful. But if you're someone who likes to have all that data, that's a great resource to have. And like I said, there's probably 25 or 30 files in there, and I probably use 4 of them. Just depends on what you're looking for, but that's a great source of data that gets you. And every Sunday night, Monday morning, Monday night after the Monday night game, boom, it's in my inbox. Within a couple hours after the game, so it's there, very timely as well. So that's one source that I've started to use the last few years as well.
Ron, what about you?
I don't have any go-to source for hard data. I'm looking at play-by-play data. I'm comparing data from fourth quarters to first quarters and different running backs when they're in the game, when they're not in the game, pass sets, different opponents. A lot of it is manual, but like we talked pre-show, when I'm doing this manually, I'm learning. It's coming into my head by osmosis, and it's helping me form an opinion. For narratives from beat writers and the team and stuff that I may miss if I'm just going through and just casually looking at the next week's game, I'll go to the site Sports Spider, SPYDER, and you can get a cluster of articles for each team that come out. It's like 10 articles every hour will come out, and they can talk about specific injuries. They could talk about the depth chart, people who have been added, transactions, what the coach said, recaps of the game from the coach, the players, and so on. So you get little tidbits on the next opponent, how they feel about that. So I'm getting narratives all in one neat little package by going to this one site. And then the data, it's a combination of manual and just looking at play-by-play.
This has made me realize that this show makes it very easy to point out something that I say quite often is when I listen to a lot of people that are betting football and they're analyzing why, they like their team and they're focusing on one or two different stats like EPA or something else. Going through this show and looking at all these factors and knowing all the numbers that are going in, I think it's pretty darn clear that anybody that's just looking at a couple of numbers is really missing something valuable. This is a full body of work handicap that starts at the beginning of the season, lasts all year long, never stops, and is never just one thing. And it's overvaluing or undervaluing anything, I think, is a critical handicapping mistake. Am I onto something there?
You are. I try to look at, first of all, to me, NFL, it's not a huge sample size every year. So I'm just always trying to find things, as I said at the beginning, kind of beneath the surface that aren't obvious. And I try to look at team profiles a little bit. We talked about this last year, Chris, at the beginning of the year, and the Bears have made a big shift now, coaching and all that. So I'm not suggesting this example that goes forward, but for a number of years there, the Bears were horrible on the road against good teams. Define good teams as simply above 500. They just could not play with that level of team. They got destroyed. I remember looking at the Packers against San Francisco in the playoff game last year. This is a team, Green Bay, that's won 13 games in a row, 3 years in a row now since Matt LaFleur got there. They played, and I'm doing this off the top of my head, so it might not be 100% accurate. They played, I believe, 3 games at home as a home favorite against teams, I want to say that are above 500. Again, I might be slightly off on that. But they have not been at home and favored against good teams very often. So, yes, they've had great home records, but they haven't played a lot of tough teams. And those 3 games that they played, they've either lost or won by 5 or fewer points. But they're deemed as a very good team, so they're laying 7, 8, 9 points at home. So to your point, I like to dig deep and dig into team profiles and just see what are they made up. And okay, they're playing this team this week. How do they look against that team over the last year or two? Again, assuming that the team has kind of stayed the same. Pro Football Reference is a good website to go to and just see stuff.
Yeah.
And one other website that I use a lot, NFL.com, they do playbooks for every NFL game. They're about 20 or 30 pages long. They got all data that you would ever want in any of those playbooks. And they're just a good reference for drive data and different things as well. So I agree. For me, it's all about you got to dig deep and just try to uncover something that's not out there in the mainstream.
Ron, do you see other people making the mistake of focusing their handicapping on too few of inputs? What do you do?
Well, there's that slogan. What is it? A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Are we overdoing it? Are we scaring our listeners and viewers right now? And I just think it's all about approach. You don't want to cram for a test. It's not the right way to go through. If you cram for week 6, 3 days before week 5 happens, maybe you get by that week, but that's not the way you should go. I'm handicapping each game of each season in August. So if I'm looking at the Green Bay Packers versus the Minnesota Vikings, I've already handicapped that game from the Green Bay Packers point of view and from the Minnesota Vikings point of view. And when it gets time for that game, either they've met my criteria beforehand about how they're performing in terms of offensively, defensively, yards per carry, pass defense. I don't want to do this on the fly. It's just spacing it out. You do need to uncover every rock that you can because the NFL, there aren't that many edges in the NFL. It's a tough sport to handicap. But if you do your homework and if you do it in a way where you're not cramming, you can get some edges. You're not forced to bet every game.
The reason we did this video is it's a passion project. And I'm telling you, I could talk for another 2-3 hours on this stuff. No problem at all. The time flies by quick, but we've got to wrap this up. Excellent talk. I'm sorry I'm such a bumbling navigator here, but I hope that we brought out in the open a lot of different things to consider. And as Ron referenced, you can't get overwhelmed by it all, but I think it's just important for people to understand there's a hell of a lot of moving parts, and that's why the NFL is so hard to beat. It's the hardest sport to beat, and I think the three of us have a very fine history of success, and these are just some of the things that we're doing. Any last words, Scott?
I would just say try to find a systematic approach that you do week in, week out. And that's, sometimes to find that fundamental bottom there as to how you're going to approach it is the hardest thing, but just have a systematic approach to how you go about your business. And if you do that, it helps a lot. Or follow someone that is a consistent winner. And most importantly, follow someone that's a consistent winner that actually gives you reasonings and helps educate you. I've always said, if I'm following you, Chris, and you don't give me any reasons and you keel over tomorrow, what have I gained? I don't have anything. So I want to follow people that can teach me, that can educate me, show me the way, and that just makes me better in the long run as well.
What say you, Ron?
What say me? 2 points. Number one, I believe in being methodical. Just, it's boring, but it works. It's, I have a set time of doing everything, and that works. And 2, I'm very appreciative of having Scott join us and be on the show. First time with him, have his perspective. I've always valued his perspective. And maybe number 3, I hope to do it again.
Excellent. And we greatly appreciate everybody that joined us. Again, we're just trying to put out stuff that's fun, easy. You can find Scott. It's Sixth Sense NFL on Twitter. And thanks a lot for joining us. I'll see you again soon, I hope.
Thanks, guys.